He bullied me at school, planted false reports to teachers, and at 16, accidentally poured boiling water on me. My parents always said, "He's the older one, forgive him." Yesterday, I found his notebook with a clear plan. Looking back now, I realize I was living in a nightmare disguised as a normal childhood. My older brother was always the golden child, 3 years older, taller, stronger, and somehow always managing to make everything look like an accident. When I was 10, we were wrestling in the backyard like brothers do, and suddenly I heard this awful crack. My arm bent in a way arms aren't supposed to bend. He immediately started crying, saying he was sorry, that he didn't mean to push me so hard. Mom and Dad rushed me to the hospital, and while I was getting my cast, I could hear them consoling him in the hallway, telling him it wasn't his fault, that boys will be boys. That broken arm was just the beginning. In middle school, mysterious notes would appear on teachers' desks claiming I was cheating, or that I had said something inappropriate about a classmate. I'd get called to the principal's office, confused and stammering, trying to defend myself against accusations I didn't understand. My grades started slipping because I was constantly in trouble, constantly having to prove my innocence. My brother would always be there afterwards, patting my shoulder, telling me he was sorry this was happening to me, that he couldn't understand why I was having such bad luck. The worst part was how everyone believed him. He had this way of looking genuinely concerned, of speaking in this soft, worried voice that made adults melt. Teachers would pull him aside after parent conferences, asking if everything was okay at home, if I was acting out because of stress. He'd nod sadly and say he was trying his best to help me, but that I was going through a difficult phase. Meanwhile, I was drowning in a sea of false accusations and manufactured incidents that seemed to follow me everywhere. High school brought new tortures. My locker would be vandalized with crude drawings, and somehow the security cameras always malfunctioned during those exact moments. I'd find my homework torn up in my backpack, or my lunch money would go missing from my wallet. When I complained to my parents, they'd suggest I was being careless, that maybe I should be more responsible with my things. My brother would nod along, saying he'd noticed I seemed distracted lately, that maybe I needed to focus more on my studies. The boiling water incident happened during my junior year. I was standing in the kitchen, making a sandwich for lunch, when my brother came in to make tea. He was carrying this huge pot of water from the stove, and as he passed behind me, he suddenly stumbled. The scalding water hit the back of my neck and shoulders, and I screamed like I'd never screamed before. The pain was indescribable, like someone was holding a blowtorch to my skin. He dropped the pot, water splashing everywhere, and immediately started apologizing, saying his foot had caught on the chair leg, that he was so sorry, so sorry. The burns were second degree. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital and another month at home recovering. My parents hired a nurse to help change my bandages, and my brother would sit with me every day, reading to me, bringing me ice cream, acting like the most caring sibling in the world. Everyone at school sent get well cards, and my brother made sure to deliver them personally, telling everyone how terrible he felt about the accident, how he blamed himself even though it wasn't really his fault. During my recovery, I started having nightmares. Not about the accident itself, but about a feeling I couldn't shake, that something was fundamentally wrong with my life. I'd wake up in cold sweats, with this creeping sensation that I was being watched, that every move I made was being calculated and measured by someone else. I'd catch my brother looking at me sometimes with this expression I couldn't quite read, like he was studying me, taking mental notes. Senior year was when things got really strange. I'd been working hard to rebuild my grades, staying after school for extra help, joining study groups, really trying to turn things around for college applications. But somehow, every time I was about to make progress, something would go wrong. The computer would crash just as I was finishing a major project, or I'd get sick the night before a big test, or important paperwork would go missing from my backpack. My brother, meanwhile, was thriving. He was valedictorian, captain of the debate team, had already been accepted to 3 Ivy League schools. My parents were so proud of him, constantly bragging to neighbors and relatives about his achievements. When people asked about me, they'd get this slightly embarrassed look and change the subject, or mention that I was still finding my way, that not everyone develops at the same pace. The worst part was how isolated I felt. I couldn't talk to my parents because they'd already decided I was the problem child, the one who needed to try harder, to be more like my brother. I couldn't talk to friends because most of them had been poisoned against me by years of rumors and incidents. I couldn't even talk to counselors at school because my brother had already painted me as someone who made excuses and blamed others for my problems. I started having panic attacks during my senior year. They'd hit me out of nowhere, in the middle of class, at lunch, while I was trying to sleep. My chest would tighten, my vision would blur, and I'd feel like I was drowning in invisible water. The school nurse would call my parents, and they'd pick me up with these resigned expressions, like I was just another problem they had to deal with. My brother would always volunteer to drive me home, speaking in soothing tones about how stress affects people differently, how I needed to learn better coping mechanisms. College applications were a disaster. Despite my efforts to improve my grades, my transcript was still a mess from years of academic sabotage. My essays kept getting corrupted on my computer, forcing me to start over multiple times. Letters of recommendation were mysteriously delayed or lost in the mail. I ended up applying to community college, while my brother got into Harvard with a full scholarship. The summer before my brother left for college was the strangest time of all. He became incredibly attentive, almost clingy. He'd want to hang out constantly, to go places together, to have these long conversations about our childhood and our future. He'd bring up specific incidents, the broken arm, the school troubles, the boiling water, and analyze them with this weird intensity, like he was trying to understand something important about them. One night, he suggested we go camping together, just the two of us, before he left for school. He said he wanted to bond, to make sure we stayed close despite the distance. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl, but I couldn't put my finger on why. We went to this remote spot in the mountains, and the whole time he kept asking me these probing questions about my plans, my dreams, whether I felt like I'd had a fair shot at life. That night, lying in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building to a climax. All those years of incidents, all those carefully orchestrated disasters, felt like they were leading somewhere specific. I stayed awake most of the night, listening to my brother's breathing, feeling like prey being stalked by a predator I couldn't see. Nothing dramatic happened on that camping trip, but when we came home, I noticed my brother had become even more obsessed with documenting things. He'd take photos of family dinners, of me doing homework, of random moments throughout the day. When I asked him about it, he said he wanted to remember everything before he left, that family was the most important thing in the world to him. Update 1. My brother left for Harvard that fall, and for the first time in my life, I could breathe. The constant feeling of being watched disappeared. My panic attack stopped. I started doing better in community college, making friends, feeling like maybe I could have a normal life after all. But even from hundreds of miles away, his influence lingered. He'd call every week, always asking detailed questions about my classes, my social life, my plans. He'd want to know about every grade I received, every person I talked to, every decision I made. He said he was just being a caring big brother, but something about his questions felt like an interrogation. He'd remember tiny details from previous conversations and bring them up weeks later, like he was keeping a file on me. During his winter break, he came home with this new intensity. He'd grown more confident at Harvard, more articulate, but also more calculating. He'd analyze every family interaction like he was studying for a test. At dinner, he'd steer conversations in specific directions, asking leading questions about our grandfather, about family history, about inheritance and legacy. Our grandfather had always been a mysterious figure in our family. He'd made his fortune in real estate decades ago, but he was secretive about his money and his plans. He lived alone in this massive house across town, and we'd visit him maybe once a month. He was stern and demanding, always comparing my brother and me, always asking about our achievements and our character. My brother would shine during these visits, impressing Grandpa with his grades and his ambitions, while I'd sit quietly, feeling like I was being evaluated and found wanting. That winter break, my brother started suggesting we visit Grandpa more often. He'd drive us there and dominate the conversations, talking about his experiences at Harvard, his plans for the future, his thoughts on success and family loyalty. Grandpa would nod approvingly and make these cryptic comments about how important it was to have strong character, to prove oneself worthy of the family name. I started noticing how my brother would position himself during these visits, always sitting where he could see both Grandpa and me, always steering the conversation back to comparisons between us. He'd bring up my struggles in school, my panic attacks, my general difficulties in life, but always in this concerned, loving way that made him look like the devoted big brother worried about his troubled sibling. One evening, after a particularly intense visit, I overheard my brother talking to Grandpa in the study. I couldn't make out all the words, but I heard phrases like family strength, and proving worthiness, and the weaker link. When they came out, both of them looked at me with this strange, evaluating expression, like they'd been discussing me in detail. Spring semester, my brother started coming home more often. claiming he was homesick and wanted to spend time with family. But his visits always seemed to coincide with important moments in my life, before big exams, before job interviews, before dates. He'd show up with gifts and attention, but somehow his presence would throw me off balance, make me doubt myself, make me perform poorly. I started keeping a journal during this time, trying to understand why I felt so anxious whenever my brother was around. Writing down the incidents helped me see patterns I'd never noticed before. The timing of his visits, the way he'd ask certain questions, the way problems would arise shortly after our conversations. But even seeing these patterns, I couldn't understand what they meant or what he was trying to accomplish. That summer, Grandpa had a mild heart attack. While he was recovering in the hospital, my brother became his primary caretaker, visiting every day, handling his mail, organizing his medications. He'd give us detailed reports about Grandpa's condition, about his wishes for the family, about his concerns for the future. He painted himself as the responsible grandson, the one Grandpa could rely on, while positioning me as too immature and unreliable to handle such serious responsibilities. During Grandpa's recovery, my brother started hinting about inheritance, about Grandpa's plans for the family fortune. He'd make casual comments about how Grandpa valued strength and determination, about how he wanted to leave his legacy to someone who could handle the responsibility. He never said anything directly, but the implication was clear. Grandpa was evaluating us, and my brother was winning. I tried to visit Grandpa on my own, but my brother had somehow positioned himself as the gatekeeper. He'd call ahead to let Grandpa know I was coming, but somehow Grandpa would always be too tired or too busy to see me. When I did manage to visit, Grandpa seemed different, more distant, more critical, like he'd been hearing negative things about me. By the end of that summer, I felt completely defeated. My brother was excelling at Harvard, managing Grandpa's affairs, and positioning himself as the family success story. I was struggling through community college, battling depression, feeling like a burden to everyone around me. The idea of inheritance seemed ridiculous. What could I possibly offer compared to my brother's achievements? Update 2. My brother's junior year at Harvard was when everything started accelerating. He'd call me almost daily now, always asking about my plans, my grades, my relationships. He'd offer advice about everything, what classes to take, what jobs to apply for, what girls to date. His suggestions always seemed reasonable, but somehow following his advice would lead to disasters. The classes he recommended would be too difficult, the jobs would fall through, the relationships would end badly. I started having this recurring dream where I was in a maze, and every path I chose led to a dead end. In the dream, I could hear my brother's voice calling out directions, but following his voice only led me deeper into the maze. I'd wake up sweating, with this overwhelming feeling that I was trapped in something I couldn't understand. That fall, Grandpa had another heart attack, this one more serious. My brother immediately flew home and took charge of everything: medical decisions, legal matters, family communications. He'd update us on Grandpa's condition, but he was always vague about the details, always emphasizing how fragile Grandpa was, how important it was not to stress him with too many visitors. During Grandpa's final weeks, my brother was at his bedside constantly. He'd bring homework to the hospital, studying while Grandpa slept, being the devoted grandson right until the end. When Grandpa died, my brother gave this beautiful eulogy about family legacy and carrying on traditions. Everyone praised him for his maturity and his strength during such a difficult time. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. My brother handled all the arrangements, contacting the lawyer, organizing the family gathering, making sure everything was perfect. He seemed calm and confident, like he knew exactly what to expect. I, on the other hand, was a nervous wreck, feeling like I was about to be publicly humiliated by how little I meant to Grandpa. The night before the will reading, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the years of incidents, all the ways my life had gone wrong, all the times my brother had been there to comfort me afterwards. Something about the timing felt significant, but I couldn't piece together what it meant. I got up around 3 a.m. and wandered around the house, trying to calm my nerves. I ended up in my brother's old room, which my parents had left exactly as it was when he went to college. I sat on his bed, looking at his high school trophies and certificates, feeling like a failure in comparison. That's when I noticed his desk drawer was slightly open. Inside, I could see the corner of a notebook. I knew I shouldn't snoop, but something compelled me to look. What I found inside that notebook changed everything I thought I knew about my life. Page after page of detailed plans, carefully written in my brother's neat handwriting. Dates, strategies, expected outcomes. The broken arm when I was 10, listed as Phase 1, Established Pattern of Accidents. The school incidents, Phase 2, Academic Sabotage and Social Isolation. The boiling water incident, Phase 2b, Escalation of Physical Incidents. But it was the recent entries that made my blood run cold. Phase 3, Discreditation before college admission. Phase 4, Psychological Breakdown and Dependency. Phase 5, Grandfather's Final Evaluation. Each phase had detailed subplans. How to sabotage my college applications. How to trigger my panic attacks. How to position himself as the reliable grandson while making me look unstable. How to ensure Grandpa would see him as the worthy heir and me as the family disappointment. The final entry was dated just a week ago. Grandfather's condition deteriorating. Final phase implementation ready. Subject shows expected patterns of learned helplessness and self-doubt. Inheritance transfer should proceed as calculated. I sat there for hours, reading through 12 years of systematic psychological torture, all laid out in black and white. Every incident, every accident, every moment of kindness followed by devastation, it had all been planned. My brother hadn't just been bullying me. He'd been conducting a long-term experiment in destroying my self-worth and my life prospects. But the notebook raised more questions than it answered. Why had he done this? What was he trying to achieve? The inheritance was mentioned, but there had to be more to it than just money. The level of planning, the psychological sophistication, the sheer dedication to the project, it suggested something deeper and more disturbing. I put the notebook back exactly as I'd found it and went back to my room, but I didn't sleep. I lay there thinking about every interaction I'd ever had with my brother, recontextualizing every moment of supposed brotherly love as part of a calculated campaign to destroy me. The worst part was realizing how well it had worked. I had internalized his narrative about myself, believing I was the problem child, the one who couldn't get his life together. The will reading was scheduled for 2 p.m. the next day. I spent the morning in a daze, unable to focus on anything except the notebook and what it meant. My brother was his usual charming self, comforting our parents about losing Grandpa, making sure everyone was prepared for the difficult day ahead. Watching him perform this role, knowing what I now knew, was like seeing a master actor in rehearsal. Update 3. The lawyer's office was one of those old-fashioned places with dark wood paneling and leather chairs that creaked when you sat down. The whole family was there, my parents, my brother, myself, and a few aunts and uncles. My brother sat confidently, occasionally patting my shoulder in a gesture that now felt like a predator marking territory. The lawyer began reading the will in that formal, monotone voice lawyers use for such occasions. Most of it was standard stuff, small bequests to various relatives, charitable donations, household items distributed among family members. But then he got to the main part, the part about the bulk of Grandpa's estate. This is where the first twist hit me like a freight train. Grandpa had left his entire fortune. We're talking about multiple millions in real estate, investments, and cash to whichever grandson could prove his superiority over the other through strength, cunning, and determination. The will explicitly stated that this was a competition between my brother and me, and that Grandpa had been observing us for years to determine who was more worthy. I felt sick to my stomach. All those visits, all those evaluating looks, all those conversations about character and strength, Grandpa had been pitting us against each other this entire time. But what made it worse was the realization that my brother had known about this arrangement, had been playing this game for years while I remained oblivious. The lawyer continued reading, explaining that Grandpa had detailed criteria for determining the winner. Academic achievement, leadership qualities, family loyalty, ability to overcome adversity, and something called strategic thinking were all factors. Based on these criteria, and on Grandpa's extensive notes about both grandsons, the entire inheritance was being left to my brother. My brother accepted this news with gracious humility, saying he was honored by Grandpa's trust, but sad that it had to come at my expense. He reached over to squeeze my hand, telling me he hoped this wouldn't damage our relationship, that family was more important than money. The performance was flawless. Everyone in the room was moved by his maturity and his concern for my feelings. But the lawyer wasn't finished. He pulled out a second document, explaining that Grandpa had left very specific instructions about how the inheritance should be handled. The winning grandson would receive everything, but only if he accepted the responsibility that came with it. If he chose to reject the inheritance for any reason, the entire estate would automatically go to the other grandson, with no conditions attached. This was the second twist, and it hit me like a puzzle piece clicking into place. I thought about the notebook, about 12 years of systematic psychological torture, about the phrase prove superiority. What if Grandpa's competition wasn't about who was more successful, but about who was more ruthless? What if he had designed this whole setup to test something else entirely? I looked at my brother, who was still performing his role as the gracious winner, but I could see something flickering in his eyes. Uncertainty, maybe, or concern. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had information he didn't have, like I was seeing the game from an angle he hadn't anticipated. The lawyer finished reading and began explaining the practical details of the inheritance transfer. My brother would need to sign various documents, meet with financial advisors, take control of properties and investments. It would be a massive responsibility, but he seemed ready for it. He'd been preparing for this moment his entire life. That's when I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I stood up and asked to speak privately with my brother. The lawyer said we could use his conference room, and everyone assumed I wanted to congratulate him or work out some family arrangement. But I had something very different in mind. Once we were alone, I told my brother I knew about the notebook. I watched his face carefully as I mentioned specific entries, the phases, the calculated incidents, the detailed planning. For a moment, his mask slipped completely. I saw the real person underneath, cold, calculating, completely without remorse for what he'd done to me. He didn't try to deny it or make excuses. Instead, he smiled and said he was impressed that I'd finally figured it out. He'd been wondering how long it would take me to discover the truth, and he admitted he was a little disappointed it had taken me so many years. He said it proved his point about my intelligence and observational skills. I asked him why he'd done it, and his answer was chilling in its simplicity. He said he'd always known about Grandpa's competition, had figured it out when he was 12 years old. He realized that to win, he didn't just need to be better than me, he needed to make me worse. Every incident, every sabotage, every moment of psychological torture had been designed to create a contrast that would make Grandpa's choice obvious. He said he'd studied psychology and behavioral modification, learning how to create learned helplessness, how to undermine someone's confidence, how to make them dependent on their abuser. He spoke about it like it was an academic exercise, a fascinating experiment in human manipulation. He seemed proud of his work, impressed with his own cleverness. But then I told him about the second part of the will, about the clause that would transfer everything to me if he rejected the inheritance. I watched his confidence falter as he realized there was an aspect of the game he hadn't considered. For the first time in our lives, I had information he needed. I explained my theory about Grandpa's real test. What if the competition wasn't about who was more successful, but about who was more worthy of the family fortune? What if Grandpa had been watching not just our achievements, but our character? What if he designed the inheritance structure to reveal something about both of us? My brother listened carefully, and I could see him recalculating, trying to figure out the angles he'd missed. I told him I'd been thinking about the notebook, about 12 years of systematic cruelty, about what kind of person could plan and execute such a campaign against their own family member. I asked him if he really thought Grandpa would want to leave his legacy to someone capable of such calculated evil. The conversation lasted for over an hour, but it wasn't really a conversation, it was a negotiation. I had something he wanted, and for the first time in my life, I had leverage over him. But what I wanted wasn't money or revenge. What I wanted was the truth, and the freedom to finally live my own life. Final update. The resolution came in a way I never could have predicted. After our private conversation, my brother asked for time to think about the inheritance. He said he needed to consider all the implications to make sure he was making the right decision for the family. Everyone assumed he was just being thoughtful about such a big responsibility. But I knew he was trapped. If he accepted the inheritance, he'd have to live with the knowledge that Grandpa might have been testing his character all along, that his victory might actually be a moral failure. If he rejected it, he'd lose everything he'd worked for, everything he'd tortured me to achieve. 3 days later, he called a family meeting. He said he'd been thinking about Grandpa's wishes, about what would really honor his memory. He announced that he was rejecting the inheritance because he felt it would be wrong to benefit from a competition that had damaged our family relationships. He said the money would be better used by someone who could bring the family together rather than drive it apart. Everyone was amazed by his selflessness, his maturity, his wisdom. My parents were so proud of him for putting family before money. The aunts and uncles praised him for his noble gesture. He played the role perfectly, positioning his rejection as a sign of his superior character rather than a strategic defeat. But I saw through it, and I think he knew I saw through it. In that moment, he wasn't just giving up the money, he was admitting that I had finally beaten him at his own game. For the first time in our lives, I had outmaneuvered him, had seen something he'd missed, had gained something he couldn't take away. The inheritance transfer was completed the following week. Suddenly, I went from being the family disappointment to being a multimillionaire. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of being sabotaged and undermined, I'd ended up with everything my brother had been working toward. But the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was understanding what had been done to me, and more importantly, understanding that it was never about my inadequacy or my failures. Every struggle I'd faced, every moment of self-doubt, every feeling of being less than my brother, it had all been artificially created. The person I thought I was, the weak and troubled younger brother, was a fiction he constructed. With that understanding came a kind of freedom I'd never experienced. I could finally separate my real self from the damaged version he'd created. I could see my actual capabilities, my real potential, my authentic personality. It was like emerging from a funhouse mirror and seeing my true reflection for the first time. My brother left for his senior year at Harvard, and our relationship changed completely. He no longer had power over me, no longer had the ability to manipulate my emotions or my circumstances. When he called, I could hear the difference in his voice, the loss of that subtle dominance, the absence of that predatory confidence. He'd lost his favorite game, and he knew it. I used part of the inheritance to transfer to a 4-year university, where I excelled for the first time in my academic life. Without the constant sabotage and psychological warfare, I discovered I was actually quite intelligent and capable. I made friends easily, dated successfully, and found myself becoming the person I'd always had the potential to be. The most surprising thing was that I wasn't angry. I'd expected to feel rage about the stolen years, the manufactured traumas, the systematic destruction of my self-worth. But instead, I felt something like pity for my brother. To spend 12 years of your life focused on destroying someone else's happiness, what kind of emptiness must that require? What kind of person wakes up every day and chooses cruelty as their primary activity? I realized that while he'd been busy trying to make me weak, he'd actually made himself weak. His entire identity was built around being superior to me, and once that dynamic was broken, he had no idea who he really was. His achievements at Harvard, his success with family and friends, his carefully constructed image, it was all hollow because it was all relative to his ability to diminish me. The inheritance allowed me to do something I'd never imagined possible. I got to choose my own life. I traveled, explored different interests, met new people, discovered passions I'd never had the confidence to pursue. I even started a foundation focused on helping victims of family psychological abuse, using my experience to understand and address a form of trauma that's often invisible to the outside world. My brother graduated from Harvard and got a high-paying job at a consulting firm. He moved to a different city, started a new life, tried to build an identity that wasn't based on our family dynamics. We exchanged polite emails occasionally, but the old relationship was gone forever. He'd lost his victim, and I'd lost my abuser, and neither of us knew how to be siblings without those roles. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never found that notebook, if I'd never understood the game that was being played. I probably would have spent my whole life believing I was the broken one, the unsuccessful one, the family disappointment. I would have carried his fiction about me into every relationship, every opportunity, every moment of my life. But Grandpa's final twist had given me something my brother could never take away, the truth about what had been done to me, and more importantly, the proof that I was capable of seeing it, understanding it, and ultimately overcoming it. In trying to prove his superiority, my brother had actually proven mine. He'd shown that when faced with the same information, I could choose compassion over cruelty, healing over revenge, growth over destruction. The notebook is still hidden in his old room, as far as I know. Sometimes I think about going back and reading it again, but I've decided to let it stay there. It's evidence of who he was, not who I am. My story doesn't end with his cruelty, it begins with my freedom from it. Looking back now, I can see that Grandpa's competition was never really about the money. It was about character, about who we truly were when tested by circumstances and choices. My brother had been tested by the knowledge of the inheritance, and he'd chosen to become a monster. I'd been tested by the knowledge of his betrayal, and I'd chosen to become free. The inheritance was just the prize. The real victory was becoming someone worthy of it.